I'm going to spend this video introducing you to Rhino. So we're going to move into a new unit in this class. It's the 3D modeling unit. So we're going to learn how to use the software Rhino to create 3D models, and we're also going to be rendering those 3D models later on. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and open up Rhino. If you have been following along with the course website, there is a link to the 90-day trial version of Rhino on the course website. You can also use the student version of Rhino, which I believe is available for purchase for something like $59. And that's a pretty good deal. Of course, when we start up Rhino, we get some gobbledygook about, the updates. I'm not the type of person that updates every single time I start up the software. So you'll get this startup screen, and in the startup screen, it just has a kind of like recent files that you've worked on. So those are my recent files. I actually use Rhino a lot for my work, and so you'll see some of my work down here. This is some furniture that I designed. And other things, but mostly you're going to also be using the new model button. Don't click it yet though. We're going to go ahead and start with a template, and my preferred template, because I end up actually making a lot of the stuff that I design, is the sort of small objects feet and inches template. If you're an architect, you probably want to be working on the large object inches or even the large object feet template if you're designing something that's the scale of a house. But usually I use the small objects template because pretty much anything that's smaller than a car should be able to be done with the small object template. And this is just kind of a shortcut to get all some of your settings correct in your units. So it's probably to your advantage to start with one of these templates. And again, this is the one I choose. There are other reasons. If you work with like maybe a 3D printer that you own, you may want to work in millimeters. When I'm working in my 3D printer or for my 3D printer, that sort of prints in millimeters. So it's to my advantage to use millimeters in that case. But this is kind of my general use template. So, oh, you can see, yes, I have my little friend in the background here. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new model. And now I have my sort of classic 4-pane workspace. So I think I'm going to stick myself over here. And, I changed my mind. I'm going to put myself down here. So this is basically the kind of, classic like 4-port workspace. This is probably the workspace that I use most commonly when I'm actually working on designing things. The perspective is I'll just go ahead and I'll make a small box just to kind of show you how it works. So you don't have to follow along with this. But what you get is you get the right view of the box, you get the front view, the top view, and then you get the perspective view all together. So within this perspective view, you can, of course, this is called orbiting. I'll go over all of this stuff individually. And then you can also pan it by hitting the Shift key and using the 2-fingered swipe. I'm going to go over all of those little interface movements, but what I'm really kind of trying to focus on right now is this idea of the 4 ports. So you could potentially, I'm just going to grab the line tool here. This is sort of your starting large tool set of tools. So if I grab the line tool, you can see I can work in one view, and then I can just make another line. And another. I'm hitting the Enter key, by the way, to reactivate the tool. So I want you to notice a couple of things. When we made that line in the front view, we had this box called Planar checked. And what that allows us to do is it allows us to maintain a line that is actually a flat plane when we draw it. If I uncheck that planar box, I could then maybe draw a line from here to here, and then from here to here, to here, to here, to here. And as you can see, now if I rotate my perspective view, that line is most definitely not flat in one plane. We've sort of bridged over from one plane to another. So that's what planarity means in Rhino, and it's a pretty important concept. A lot of the tools are meant to operate on planar objects or not. So I'm going to go ahead and just get rid of these lines for now because I don't think we need them. So in Rhino, you can select stuff and delete it. And here we are back with my perspective view. Well, as you noticed before, maybe you noticed, working in the line view, or when I was drawing that line, I really was working a lot in the front. And so, or also maybe you're working flat and you're working a lot in the top. So if you're doing that, like for example, if you're taking a line and, making like a fairly complicated line in one viewport, what you can do is you can actually kind of privilege that individual viewport by making it shown the most on the screen, so that you can go in and just kind of get the most sort of real estate you can on this particular view. Excuse me, geez. And then when you're done with that, you can go back to sort of the original 4-port layout. Now, you can, of course, kind of adjust your way to that 4-port layout, or you can go up here to the View menu, and where it says Set View, or rather, excuse me, Viewport Layout, you can select 4 viewports. And then it sort of re-equalizes all 4 of your viewports. When I'm working, especially initially when I'm working on a file, I do have a tendency to kind of emphasize one viewport over the other because I tend to start with flat shapes a lot. But we'll get into that later. There's a couple of other things that you need to know about the interface of Rhino before we kind of really get into actually making stuff with Rhino. So right now I'm using my trackpad to kind of navigate through the space, and it's an okay way to do it. I mean, if I'm going to be working on Rhino like all day and doing something really complicated, it could be to your benefit to get a 3-button mouse. That's what most people who use 3D animation software or any kind of like 3D rendering software tend to opt for. And mostly just for ergonomic reasons. Like if you're sitting there all day and you're working with your trackpad, it can be pretty painful after a while. So since I'm only working through a couple of hours here, I think I can handle it. And maybe you can too, but just wanted to kind of put that out there. So if you're using a trackpad and you want to, in this case, in the perspective view works a little bit differently from the other views. So if I'm doing the 2-fingered sort of swipe, that's allowing me to orbit the shape. And here, if I do the 2-fingered swipe in any other viewport, like top, right, and front, that is also the 2-fingered swipe allows me to do what's called panning. Now, if I am, for some reason, my multi-touch is disabled on my laptop, you could also go into one of these various zoom menus, and you can find the pan command there. And so it'll just allow you to click and drag with one single mouse motion. But definitely, if your computer has multi-touch support, which it probably does, it's kind of just an easy, more fluid way to do it. So another major way that you can use the multi-touch support to navigate through Rhino is with the pinching. The 2-fingered pinch, of course, is sort of the universal zoom, and that indeed is enabled in Rhino. So that can be a great way to kind of navigate your file. Another thing in the perspective view that you might want to be aware of is that if you hit the Shift key and do the two-fingered swipe, it will actually move to pan rather than orbit. So those are just some really basic kind of ways that you can use the interface. Another really important way to maybe think about using the interface is, let's say you get way out of kilter, and you're off in like La La Land. This is what I call La La Land, where you literally, I could even orbit in here and I wouldn't be able to find my object that I have selected. Like, I have literally no idea where it is. I can't find it. I can, it's gone. So this little command here with the magnifying glass with yellow stuff inside of it is called Zoom Selected. And it is like a total lifesaver. So you can even get into trouble with that kind of stuff in the perspective viewport. So let's just go ahead and get off here. So it's like so zoomed out, like I don't even know where it is. Well, it's right there, but let's just pretend like I don't know where it is. It's way out of whack. And if I click this little Zoom Selected, I have to activate the viewport. So this little viewport activation thing, and then it will allow me to kind of zoom in on my object. So those are all really great ways to kind of remember to sort of use the basic interface tools in Rhino. So let's see. The next thing that I really wanted to talk about is sort of ways that you can use these objects up at the top. And we're also going to talk about I just want to introduce you to the two sidebars. So this sidebar should be defaulted to be open. So this sidebar you can get rid of if you need the space on screen to draw. You can also pop it out into a palette if you have multiple screens. And then this sidebar over here, I'll just scooch myself over a little bit. This sidebar over here is really going to be used in more sort of advanced applications of using Rhino. But you can see here it's got sort of properties for objects, the so-called layers panel, which doesn't work much like the layers panel in Adobe Photoshop. It's a little bit different, but we will be using it for sure. So this panel, I think, is more maybe like not a panel that I would keep open all the time. And the reason that I don't keep both of these panels open all the time is because you can see how much it compresses your kind of available screen space to actually work on your object. And to be honest, this panel is another panel that I would potentially keep closed if I'm not kind of changing tools. So we're going to keep it open for now because we're going to be using the tools a lot. So I'll move myself over here, and we're going to think about doing something that we're going to do some drawing for. And I'm just going to start showing you some of the basic functions of Rhino. Okay, we're back. Hi, everyone. Now, before we kind of get going with really testing out some of the drawing tools, I'd like to direct you to something that we can sort of set up for ourselves to kind of make things a lot more consistent and really just make sure that the software is behaving the way that we want to. So I'm going to right now kind of maximize the top view. I'm going to go ahead and click into it so that it's the active view, although that doesn't necessarily matter. So you can see here that we have a certain type of grid, and that grid right now, we don't know how big it is. We don't really know what these grid units correspond to. So it would be a really good idea for us, I think, to go ahead and set up our grid. So this is something that I do in the file really anytime I make a drawing. I make sure that my grid is set up. And this is kind of outside of using the template. So I'm going to zoom in on my grid while I actually make my settings, just so I can kind of check and make sure that everything is cool. I'm going to go to the File menu, and I'm going to click the Settings function. And then you'll see the settings for the file. So even though we may have chosen a template, our units are reflective of that template. There it looks like we're in feet. Actually would prefer inches. I thought I chose the inches template. And then here, we're going to throw away everything that's actually in this model, so we can go ahead and scale it. It doesn't matter. If you have nothing in the grid, it won't ask you that question. So we can come over here to layout and also make sure that's in inches. The rest of this stuff I don't really mess around with that much, but you certainly could if you wanted to. So this is all fine. So the main thing here that we want to set up is the grid, and we have a line count. And the line count is basically going to just dictate literally like kind of how big your grid is. So right now, if we look at our grid, it's got a relatively high line count, as you can see. Right now, it's got minor grid lines every 0.1 inches. That's kind of weird. You don't usually think of things in 1/10 of an inch. And then it has major lines every 10 minor grid lines. So that's sort of a decimal grid, which would be useful if we were working in millimeters. But because we're working in inches, I think that the grid should be set up a little bit differently. So what we want, I think, is a major line every 4 minor grid lines. And then here, a minor grid line every 1/4 inch. And so what that's going to give us is it's going to basically give us the equivalent of quadrille graph paper. So you may remember something like that if you've ever seen paper, ha 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 ha, or if you've ever sort of like played around with graph paper. So the other thing that I like to set when I'm in this mode is snap spacing. And in this case, I want the snap spacing. So let me show you real quickly what the snap spacing is. So right now the snap spacing is 0.1 inches. So that means that it's actually not going to snap, within these grid lines, because these grid lines are 0.25, and then this is a 1-inch grid line. So I can do a couple of different things. I can make my snap spacing every 1 inch. So that means that it will snap to every 1-inch block here. Or I could make my snap spacing 0.25, which is what I think I'm going to do for when I'm making smaller objects. Okay, so this should all be fine at this point. And this is kind of a great setup for making small objects with inches. If you wanted to make larger objects, like if you wanted to make objects that were like maybe the size of a house, I would probably bump this up to 12, and then I would bump this up to 1, and this up to 1 as well. And that would give you 1 foot by 1 inch grid, which would be pretty nice, I think, for larger objects. So now I can go ahead and just close this, and my settings are kind of enabled for the file. So you can see now, I'm going to go ahead and just drag and select everything. And I'm just going to hit the delete key. So now there's one more thing, maybe 2 more things about the environment that I want to go over before we kind of really start drawing. One is I want to go over this idea of grid snapping. And so we set up our grid snap to be 1/4 inch. So I'm going to zoom in on the grid so I can actually see stuff. And I'm going to take the Polyline Tool. And so the Polyline Tool is just 1 down on this drop-down menu. As you can see, most of these tools have these really long drop-down menus. Now, if we were approaching the Polyline Tool for the first time, we might say, okay, over here, the tool activates this set of prompts. So we first are asked, what is the start of the polyline? Well, you can see my snapping is working quite nicely, and it's snapping to the grid. This may seem like a minor detail to you, but it's actually critically important in Rhino that things kind of snap together. Otherwise, certain functions won't work later on down the line. So then it asks me for the next point of the polyline. And I'm just going to draw like a little line design here. And I can just keep drawing points. Keep in mind that this is certainly a straight line, so it has straight segments. There's another setting for a line with curved segments. I think I'm going to go ahead and close this polyline even and make it just a little bit more advanced. So I'm going to go ahead and just make that a mirror of the same shape here. And I'm going to leave a little bit of thickness between those two pieces. So I want you to notice that right now we're drawing all in the same kind of view. So inherently, that means that our design should be planar. So you can see here it is indeed planar. If we go ahead and activate the planar setting, what happens is we can take the Polyline tool and we can actually draw in the perspective view or in any other combination of views, and it will also be planar or flat. So if we highlight this, you can see over here on the right view that it certainly is all kind of like on a flat plane, even though here it sort of appeared to not be. So in general, I would say I don't really ever draw on the perspective view unless you really want to get that weird effect that comes from kind of drawing in perspective. I usually do most of the drawing in Rhino on one of these flat views. And then if you kind of get more advanced or get further into it, you can actually kind of transpose a flat view onto just about any angle, which is also a neat trick. That's called moving the C-plane, if anybody wants to explore that. So, well, what difference does it make then, you may be asking, if you have planar checked or not? Well, let's uncheck planar, and then let's similarly draw a flat shape here. Well, that means that we can basically go outside of our plane, which we did once before. And so you can draw on multiple viewports and get something out of that is clearly not flat, right? It's not planar. Okay, so let's go ahead and we're kind of building up this collection of strange shapes. Let's go ahead and stay in our top view, and I want to make a couple more shapes. So another thing that we could probably do with the polyline, or let's use the control point curve just for fun. Now, let's say I want to start my curve here. So it's asking me for the start of curve. And it's very similar to the Polyline tool where I'm basically just building up points. Now, you can see here I can draw my point pretty much anywhere, right? If I wanted to constrain the points that I draw by 90 degrees, I could activate the ortho mode up here. And I think I'm also going to activate planar. I usually keep planar on just for reasons of pure superstition, because in a lot of cases it's not good to have a shape that isn't planar. When you're drawing. When you're doing other stuff, it doesn't matter as much, but when you're sort of just drawing those initial kind of what I would call construction curves, it's probably a good idea to leave it enabled. So now that ortho has been enabled right here, I've got my grid snap going, I've got my ortho going, and you can see it's constraining me to draw in 90 degrees from the original point. So here I can draw here, and here, and here, and here, and I can just make myself like a little curved thing. So with control point curves, they're kind of funky. They're very similar to the pen tool in Photoshop and Illustrator. And what you're basically doing is you're basically drawing points to kind of constrain the curve on. So it's a little bit indirect. So here we're gonna draw a point here, but it's not gonna make a hard corner. It's gonna kind of like move away from that corner. And I'm just gonna do one more of these kind of units. And actually, I think I'm going to undo my last point to make it more similar to the one I just drew a second ago. And then I'm going to come up here and do one more sort of unit. So, and then I'm basically going to just like end my curve. I'm not going to close it. I'm just going to leave it open. So what an open curve or an open line means basically is that it doesn't have a closed shape. In other words, it's not fully joined. So it has an open point here and it has an open point here. These are all examples of closed shapes. They're all fully closed, meaning that there's no sort of gaps to allow any, theoretical air come in here. And, their sort of points are all kind of perfectly touching together. So this shape also is closed. So it doesn't matter if a shape is planar or not planar, what matters for certain functions in Rhino is that it's closed or open. So some functions want open curves like this one, and some functions would like closed curves like this one. So I want to show you just a couple of other things kind of related to this sort of thing here. This Smart Track function is something that, I think is pretty great. I usually leave it on. When you have Smart Track on and you go to really any like drawing tool, it will kind of give you a lot of options. So here it's asking if we want to snap to the end point. And we could certainly do that. If we snap to the end point, then we know that it's perfectly touching. It's also giving us feedback about how far our point is from the point that we just drew, and also what the angle is. And that's it's really nice. So I think those are all generally pretty good things. Now, if I just go down here, I'm going to go ahead and kind of try to close our shape. So I'm going to hit enter. We're done. You can just hit the enter key. Now, this is sort of a trick question. Is this a closed shape? This is a closed shape. This is a closed shape, and this is a closed shape. One way that you can tell is if you look down here at the bottom bar, you can see that one curve was added to the selection. So that's a pretty good indication that this is a closed curve. If we select these, you can see that's two curves added to the selection. So two curves does not equal one closed curve. In order to make this into a closed curve, we would need to use this button right here that says join. And if two things are perfectly touching, you'll get some feedback that says, hey, two curves have been joined into one closed curve. And so now we could potentially use this as a closed curve. I'm going to go ahead and undo the last two things that I did. And just to kind of show you a couple of things that you can do that might, give you a little bit more sort of a fun experience with Rhino, we're going to go ahead and do some stuff to these curves so you can see what the whole point of drawing these curves are. And then when we go ahead and get these kind of into 3D form, we're going to look at these other functions up here. So I think I'm going to start by doing what I think is probably one of the most simple ways to create a surface. So I'm moving these around just by clicking and dragging them. Because I have ortho and planar enabled, I'm not going to do too much damage, but I do have to take kind of an extra step to move them once to go right and once to go up. You can also use the move tool. We'll talk about that in the next video. Clicking and dragging is great. I mean, it's definitely a way to do things in Rhino. It's not the most precise way to do things. So if you're kind of doing like rough movement like we're doing right now, where you just want to get something out of the way, clicking and dragging is a perfectly reasonable way to do it. So, all right, so here in the top view, we have a shape, and we would like, I think, to go ahead and make it dimensional. So I'm going to, over here, just kind of navigate so I can see it in my perspective window. And I'm going to go ahead and go to the solid menu. I'm going to kind of skip ahead. I'm going to go to the solid menu, and I'm going to ask it to extrude planar curve. So I'm going to do that straight. And then it asks me for an extrusion distance. So I don't want to extrude it to make it like crazy high. So I'm going to kind of eyeball it. And it looks like this is about maybe 5 inches. I can verify that over here. And you can see indeed that's about 5 inches. So you can kind of eyeball it by, just adjusting it on the grid and looking at it, or you can type in the extrusion distance. There are some other features that you can enable. You can have it actually extrude from both sides equally, and you can also do some other things. And it looks like I just accidentally clicked on that. So let me go to the solid menu, extrude planar curve, straight, and we want to go 5 up, yes, and I'm just going to hit enter. And so now you can see over here that I have kind of a dimensional object that has been made from that simple flat curve. And this might be a really good time for me to kind of zoom to the extents if I want to kind of focus on it and make it visible. You may be noticing that it looks like my perspective view is in wireframe view mode. Wireframe view mode is definitely the best mode for the drawing, whichever one you're using for drawing. Since I tend to, most people tend to use the perspective view as like a preview window, I think that I prefer to keep the perspective window in a drawing mode that kind of illustrates a little bit more about the object. So I'm just going to do a control click here, and under view, I'm going to choose ghosted. That's sort of my personal favorite. The great thing about ghosted is that you can kind of see inside the object, but you can also tell if the faces are there. We can also maybe try a couple of other modes just to kind of show you what they do. We can also go to shaded, which is another really popular mode. So shaded is going to kind of fill it in and be 100% opaque. That's another great mode. So usually when I'm using the perspective view, I'm using either shaded or ghosted. Occasionally you will need to actually see through or see into an object, so that's what ghosted is good for. I think the rest of the time shaded is probably fine. The whole idea of using a mode like this is that you want to be able to distinguish objects that have what are called surfaces, so these kind of filled in areas, and objects that are just plain line. So we're going to talk more about this idea of curve, surface, polysurface, and solid. But that's basically the kind of hierarchy of shapes and forms in Rhino. So we'll be talking about that throughout the next several videos. So once again, another real easy way to look at, a shape. Now, can we extrude planar curve on this non-planar curve? Well, let's see what happens. Of course, the answer is most likely no. It is going to ask us to extrude it. Yeah. And it did actually do it. That's kind of amazing. It usually won't do it. But you'll notice that what it didn't do, and this is because it's not planar, you'll notice that it didn't actually make a top and a bottom for it. And the reason that it didn't do that is because it's just not able to do that. So we could certainly make a top and a bottom for it, but we would have to do it through some other means. So I might come back to this kind of problem of dealing with non-planar shapes later, but I just wanted to kind of like let you know that, when it says extrude planar curve, and if you want to get perfect results, you may not get perfect results if you start with a non-planar curve. And there are lots of functions like that in Rhino. So, okay, so let's kind of resituate ourselves here. Half of the time, I think, when I'm working in Rhino, I'm just spending my time kind of navigating so that I can see stuff. So I think I'd like to deal with this shape next. And with this shape, I think we can consider a really cool way of making form in Rhino, which is called revolving. And so instead of starting with a kind of a flat shape and like sort of extruding it, or sometimes I think of like, raising it or squeezing it, or, like squeeze through a tube or something like that. In this case, we can actually take the shape and we can define an axis for the shape to rotate around. And then we can make the shape kind of blanket around an axis. So let's go ahead and do that. So for this function, I'm going to find it in the surface menu. And you can see that even the menus of Rhino are sort of shaped, kind of acknowledge this hierarchy that I mentioned, where you have a curve, then you have a surface, and then you have a solid or a poly surface. So it's just something to take note of. So within the surface menu, I'm going to go ahead and select Revolve. So the start of the revolve axis so the axis doesn't have to actually touch the form. So what's going to happen is if I go over here to the right view, I think this is probably, or well, maybe the front view is probably the easiest way to see this. So I'm going to do some pinching here. So this is actually the front view of this right here. Okay. So if I set my point right here, it's going to basically put some empty space between the axis and the actual form. And that's totally fine. All you really need for an axis is a straight line. So this is another situation where having ortho enabled gives you that nice straight line. Can you do it on a not straight line? Absolutely, you can. But sort of the conventional way is to use a line that is at a 90-degree angle from the object. So then it's going to ask you for a start angle. I'm going to zoom in on this just a little bit more, see if we can get in here. So it's asking for a start angle, which we can use 0 for a start angle right now. It also has this setting for full circle, which is sort of like a shortcut to just do that. And that is in fact kind of what we wanted. So in this case, you can see that we've kind of whisked it along a full circle, and it basically just becomes kind of like a tube. And so this can be a really great way to make shapes like, if you think about, furniture or like maybe objects that might be in an interior, anything that, like vases, cups, bottles, chair legs, candles, tons and tons of stuff can be kind of begun with this process. Just to kind of show you how this ends up kind of working, you can see that we have what it's generated is basically a surface. And so this is a surface, this is a surface, and this is a poly surface. Now, what makes this a surface is that it doesn't have any thickness. So if we were to, excuse me, kind of look inside of it, this actual surface has zero thickness. It's kind of an abstraction. So if we were to cap the holes on each side, then it would become a solid. But right now, because it has these holes, it's technically just a surface. The reason this is a surface is for the same reason. It doesn't actually have any thickness. This, because it's a solid, this piece right here, it has a thickness. It has like an interior mass. So to frame it another way for you, this shape could be 3D printed. None of these other shapes could be 3D printed. Of course, it's easy enough to make this into a solid. If you look at the solid menu, it does have a function called cap planar holes. And now it has gone ahead and just created those caps. So you can see now, if we select this, it's saying one poly surface added to the selection. That's true. Here, it's also saying one poly surface added to the selection. So poly surface basically just means it's more than one surface. If I undo that cap, you can see one surface was added to the selection. And then when we kind of redo that cap, now it become a poly surface. And this is also going to be an extrusion, technically, which is also a type of poly surface. So let's try one or two more things with this. Now, I want you to notice in our top view here, and again, this is sort of just like the very first, very first foray into Rhino. So it's can be kind of overwhelming. We want, I think in this case, to just go ahead and remake this object. So we can do that really easily because the curve that we made the object from is still there. So if I select from here, you can see it has there are multiple objects that I could potentially select. So it's giving us an option to choose. And what I'm going to choose in this case is the curve. So I'm going to go ahead and just drag the curve over a bit to make another object. And I want to kind of illustrate to you what happens when we move that axis. So this was made with a full kind of 90-degree axis. And if we take the same curve and we do the Revolve command, we can start it in basically the same place. Or if we start it actually on the object, we won't wind up with a hole. So sometimes, a hole is desirable, sometimes it's not. And then right now I'm kind of limited to a very discrete 90-degree angle. That's because I have ortho enabled. So I'm actually going to turn this off temporarily. And I'm going to get crazy. So I think I'm going to go ahead and make the axis over here. And I'm going to do it on a full circle. So that's just kind of an illustration of how you can really play with, this idea of where is this shape actually going. And so in this case, we, rotated it on a different axis and we get a really drastically different shape. Last thing for this first video, you may be asking yourself, well, what if I want to straighten this out? That's a great question. You could rotate it. So we're going to talk about some basic, maybe some basic transformations for a second. So let's say that I want to rotate this thing and stick it on top of this. That's not a terrible idea. So the first thing I want to do probably is rotate this so that it's 90 degrees. So I can just go ahead and select this object. Now, if I don't want to rotate the curve, all I need to do is just make sure that I only select the surface, and then the curve will still kind of linger there. Now, over in the rotate command, there's a few different flavors of rotation. This is sort of the simple rotate. And my recommendation is that you left click it. So it will be technically in rotate 2D mode. And so that's a way of rotating it that kind of rotates it within one of these flat views. So the center of the rotation, well, in this case, I think this should be the pivot point for sure. And then the first reference point, what I would call the first reference point is just the direction of the object. So in this case, you can see I'm snapping to certain things. Those are set over here, by the way, so you can change them if you want. It's not necessary. Just snapping to this quadrant is totally fine. And then your second reference point is going to be that sort of 90-degree value, right? So it just so happens because we have the snaps enabled, you can just kind of snap to it. We could also re-enable ortho, and you could see it would toggle between different 90-degree values. Either of those would be fine. Okay, so as promised, it didn't rotate our curve, but we could go ahead and take this now and we could kind of stack it on top of this. Now, if we do it with the, I'm going to just move this over real quickly so it's not in the way. If we do this with just by dragging, that's going to be less than ideal for a couple of reasons. One of the main reasons is that when it snaps, it's not really snapping to like a place that we really want it to go, maybe. So if we snap it to this quadrant, for example, you can see down here in the front view that it's like a little bit off. It's like not quite registering in this view. So there's a couple of different ways that you could deal with this. You could move it in this dimension first and then move it in this dimension. And that's okay. There's nothing really wrong with that. You kind of get the same result. It's a little clumsy, you know, like it's more than one step. Or you could do what I think is probably the preferred method, which is to actually define a point and then move it to another defined point. So I'm going to actually use this is one case where I would use my perspective view, because again, we can kind of actually see stuff. So I'm going to activate the view and then zoom extents. And I basically just want to find this sort of center point of this shape, which happens to be right there. And now that I know where that point is, I'm going to go ahead and activate the Move tool, which is right here. And so this is what you would use if you want to not sort of click and drag things. If you want a little bit more precision, you can use the Move tool. And in the Move tool, you select a point to move from. And you can see that my snap over here, these are called your snaps. I think this is a great sort of starting value to have your snaps set to. So you could just pause for a second and use these settings. I'm going to add center to mine. And then here I'm snapping to the end point, which looks just absolutely perfect. I can double check in both views that it's that exact point that I want. Okie dokie. So now what I can do is I can come over here and find the sort of point that I want to send it to, which happens to be, no, not quite. Yes, except I have to kind of rotate around because I want to actually send this to the top here. Haha, that makes sense now. So in this case, just because this would be a great place for me to use the ghosted viewport, I actually want to hit the center right there of that little cap on the top. So when you're using the snaps, they can be a little bit frustrating. You can see our thing is kind of toggling around all over the place. You have to just be really patient and kind of wave the mouse around where you want to go. And sooner or later, it's going to select the point that you actually want. So in this case, that's the center. And then you can just click it. Or hit enter if you don't want to mess it up by clicking it. So that's how we get a fairly precise move action going on this sort of weird blobby thing. So I think that's enough for just right now. I'm going to be kind of coming at you in the next video with a couple of kind of simple projects. So we're going to make some furniture. And of course, we're not really like thinking about literally making furniture. It's just a way for me to show you some of the tools. And we will be thinking about making an environment eventually. And one of the things that environments usually have is stuff. So we're going to make some stuff that could potentially go in an environment. So I'll see you all again real soon.